So, I'm on YouTube the other day, and this video pops up in my feed of some guy that I've never seen before in my life talking about his top 20 albums of all time. Let's see what random guy's taste in music is, I thought, so I started watching it. And I ended up watching the whole half-hour long video. And then I watched another one of some other random guy's top 20 albums of all time. And then they started showing up in my feed. So down the rabbit hole I went, watching random guys' videos of their top 20 albums of all time. And then I thought, hey, I'm a random guy. I've got a YouTube channel. I've got my soapbox, and I'm sure I've got 20 favorite albums of all time. I'll make my own bloody video of my top 20 albums of all time, and maybe some other random guys will watch my video. So here we go. Now, if you watch my channel or sub to my channel, you probably know me as a guitar player and may expect my top 20 to be full of Steve Vai albums and Joe Satriani and Jeff Beck and so on and so forth. But that's not really the case. For the most part, what I like to play doesn't mesh up very well with what I like to listen to on a daily basis, or albums that have meant a lot to me over the years. At times, it's actually quite far removed, as you'll soon see. Sure, there'll be a few guitar-centric albums on here, but not a lot. While I certainly appreciate a good guitar instrumental album, who doesn't? It's not the type of stuff that I put on in the car or when I'm just chilling at home. My taste in music is pretty much all over the place. As a teenager into my mid-20s, it was pretty much all metal and hard rock. But when I was 25, I got a job as a record store manager at a Sam the Record Man in Canada. The music that I like to listen to, metal, basically, couldn't be played in the record store. It was too heavy. So I had to spend 8 hours a day discovering new music that was suitable to play in the record store, and that's when I started to broaden my musical horizons beyond strictly rock and metal. And thank God, I was ignoring so much good music that was out there, artists like Elvis Costello and the Talking Heads and the Smiths and Tori Amos and Van Morrison and so on and so forth. So anyway, let's get started. This is the type of stuff that I like to listen to, and these would be my favorite albums of all time. So let's get underway with number 20. I'm going to start out immediately with a curveball for you. This is number 20. This is Mind Bomb by the British band The, released in 1989. Technically not a band per se, as for the majority of their albums, it was just one guy, Matt Johnson. He had released 2 albums before Mind Bomb, and it was pretty much synth-driven, post-punk type of stuff that one could dance to, I suppose. Mind Bomb was a huge departure for The and Matt Johnson. Matt finally decided to form an actual band for this album, and joined up with the very formidably skilled guitarist Johnny Marr from the Smiths. While their previous albums had been pretty light and airy, almost new wave affairs, Matt would turn things very dark on Mind Bomb, taking on religion and politics and death and war and failed relationships, very controversial stuff. Much of it too controversial for radio play, though it did chart very high upon release. Side 1 of this album is just devastating stuff. Good Morning Beautiful, Armageddon Days, Violence of Truth, and an incredibly sad love song, I suppose, that he duets with Sinead O'Connor, Kingdom of Rain. Side 2 lightens up a little bit, but not much. And the sound of this album. I remember when I was working in Sam the Record Man, the record store, when this album came out, the audiophiles who frequented the record shop were just foaming at the mouth upon this release. This was one of the big audiophile releases of the year, of the decade. One of those albums to test out your $10,000 home stereo or $400 or $500 headphones. Just an incredible album from a sound engineering standpoint. Good stuff, really good stuff. Give it a listen if you're unfamiliar with it. I guess standout tracks would be basically the entirety of side 1, and just put some headphones on and listen to this album. Just great stuff. Anyway, moving on. Number 19. On to number 19, and something equally dark, much darker actually. And much heavier. My first foray into death metal with 2005's Ghost Reveries by Swedish band Opeth at number 19. Now, while I've always liked my music on the heavier side, death and black metal was never really my thing. Not a big fan of the growling vocals. So until this release, Opeth were really never on my radar. Thinking back, I have no idea what turned me on to this album. I must have read some good reviews or something for it. So I decided to give it a shot, and I went out and I bought it. I threw it in the CD player. Track 1, Ghosts of Perdition, bam, growling vocals about 5 seconds into it. I have no idea what he's saying, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm not going to like this. And then I kept listening, and then the growling stopped, and then this absolutely gorgeous voice appeared out of the noise. And this track, it turned into an absolute masterpiece of progressive rock for the next 4, 5, 6 minutes. And then near the end, the growling comes back for a brief reprise at the end, and then it's over. And bloody hell, growling or no growling, that was amazing, I thought. Let's try track 2. And the baying of the hounds, and more of the same. A bit of growling at the beginning, a bit of more beautiful singing, and some of the most incredible prog metal that I had ever heard in my life. I'm enjoying this very much at this point. Despite the odd bit of growling vocals here and there. And I'm actually starting to appreciate the growling a bit more as it suits the music so perfectly. Just a brilliant album from Opeth. I'm now officially a fan, 15 to 20 years later. I dug into their back catalog and I found that it's more of the same. Their album Blackwater Park from a few years earlier is just equally brilliant. If you're into prog and metal, you could do a whole lot worse than this. I play this in the car still once in a while, and my wife absolutely loves it. She hates it. I guess standout tracks on this one would have to be Ghost of Perdition, track 2, The Baying of the Hounds, and the final track is amazing as well, The Grand Conjuration. Just an amazing prog metal album. And that's all I got to say about that one. So on to number 18. Strong left turn here again. Number 18 is The Unforgettable Fire by U2. Believe it or not, once upon a time it was cool to like U2, back in the 80s. There was no pretentiousness. Well, there was a little, I suppose. Bono vox, good voice in Latin, and the edge. But what can you do? They were loved by most and hated by few at the time. I know, I was there, and I bought the concert tickets, and I bought their albums. I don't know what the hell they've been doing for the past 25 years or so. They got old, I guess. So, but since Achtung Baby, brilliant album by the way, their music has become just bland and uninspiring and boring. I keep listening and I keep getting disappointed with every album in the last 20 years. I haven't heard a song by this band that excited me in a long time. But back then they had fire, unforgettable fire. So sorry about that. Their first album, what was it? Boy. And then October, and then War, and they just kept getting bigger and bigger until their follow-up, Unforgettable Fire, and that was the album that made them really put them over the top. Well, not quite. Then Joshua Tree put them up here. Unforgettable Fire put them here. It was their first collaboration with Brian Eno and Daniel Lanois, and it was an unlikely pairing, but it really worked. And this album gave them a huge boost forward, and just so many great classic tracks. Pride in the Name of Love, Sort of Homecoming, the title track, and of course, Bad. Probably my all-time favorite U2 track. I think it's the best song they ever wrote, an absolutely gorgeous song. And then they lost me again for a few years. Their follow-up, Joshua Tree, was obviously their biggest selling album, but I personally didn't love it. Red Hill Mining Town was a great song, the first song on side 2. The one song that really would have fit on The Unforgettable Fire. But the rest just didn't really do it for me. It was a bit mellow and it was a bit too radio friendly. And then they got into the rattle and hum phase where they self-professed that they thought they were bigger than they were and that they could do anything they wanted to. Before finally realizing that direction that they were going in was the wrong one. And then they hunkered down and knew that they had to create a masterpiece, and they did. They created Achtung Baby, which is one of the greatest albums of all time as well. It's just not my favorite U2 album. It's probably my second favorite after The Unforgettable Fire. But yeah, just a killer U2 album. And but you know, they've had peaks and valleys throughout their whole career, but you know, they've stayed one of the biggest bands in the world throughout. But anyway, on to number 17. Number 17, Getting Heavy Again, from 2001, Tool. Tool's third album, Lateralis. Now, I don't know what I was listening to in the late 90s, probably still grunge. But I somehow missed out on Tool's first two albums. I had heard a few songs here and there, Stinkfist and Push It and Sober and Prison Sex and all great songs, but nothing that really made me a huge fan to run out and buy their albums. And I guess that I had made the mistake of lumping them into maybe the new metal crowd with like Korn and Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park and the like, music that I really didn't much care for. Like I said, grunge is what I was still into in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I had pretty much thought that good metal music was dead at this point. All the great metal bands from my youth were producing nothing of note. Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Sabbath and you know, and this new metal stuff was not anything that I wanted to listen to. And then came Lateralis, and holy hell, now this I could get into. Metal was back, and back in a big way, complex and heavy and progressive and aggressive and deep. You know, with weird and interesting videos to match. And this I liked very, very much. Not a weak track on this one, 77 minutes of prog metal bliss. But if I had to pick a few standout tracks, I'd have to go with the title track, Lateralis, Schism, Parabola. Hell, the whole thing is fantastic. I got to sit down and revisit that one soon. I've still got the hard copy of this one here. Anyway, huge diversion here at number 16, Abacab by Genesis. What the hell happened to Genesis in the 80s? Well, I guess I know what happened to Genesis. Phil Collins and Success happened to Genesis. They went from a band that I loved to one that I loathed. Hard to pull off, but they managed. Back in their prog days in the 70s, I was a bit young to get into Genesis. I was like 8. But when 1981 rolled around, I was about 16 or 17, and my formidable guitar years, when I was locked in my bedroom for 10 to 12 hours a day practicing, from what I remember, it was a lot of Ozzy Osbourne and Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Black Sabbath. And what possessed me to go out and buy Genesis' Abacab album at this point in my life, I have no idea, but I did. And I loved it. It was not really my style of music, like I just stated, but something about it really struck a chord with me, this kind of like art rock stuff. I guess it was my first real introduction to prog. Maybe that was it. Now, the album Abacab at this point was pretty much prog light, art rock by Genesis standards. Yet it intrigued me. I went back and listened to some of their back catalog, and I was pretty much lost. Prog light was fine, but heavy prog was, at the time, not my thing. Well, I liked a few tracks here and there from their past, like Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and the Carpet Crawlers. Most of it I couldn't get into at all. Abacab, however, worked for me. The title track, Dodo Lurker, Keep It Dark, hell, even the slower tracks on this, like Man on the Corner and Me and Sarah Jane, I really liked a lot. But the standout track for me, and probably my favorite Genesis track of all, is Like It or Not, one of the slower tracks on Abacab. Though I can't say there are no weak tracks on this. Who Done It is an awful experiment, but overall, I absolutely adore this album. And then they released another decent album, Prog Light, with their self-titled Genesis after Abacab. But the cracks were starting to show, and more precisely, mainstream success and boatloads of money were showing. And they turned to absolute radio-friendly shit for the rest of their careers, and sadly, but, they got rich. So on to number 15. From 1988, it's R.E.M's Green. Now, an odd choice of R.E.M. albums, I'm sure. It's not considered by many to be their best album. That distinction would probably go to Automatic for the People, while many others would prefer their earlier indie label stuff like Murmur or Document or Fables of the Reconstruction. But Green was my introduction to R.E.M. and remains my favorite album to this day. Back in my record store days, I wasn't too heavily into smaller indie type bands. So R.E.M. weren't even really on my radar. I had heard the odd hit that they had, Fall on Me, and the one I love, but it was Green when it was released when I was working in the record store, and it was an album that I absolutely fell in love with and made me a big enough fan to go back and check out their back catalog and fall in love with their back catalog and be a big fan of R.E.M. going forward. Despite the poppier numbers on this one, like Get Up and Stand, the rest of it's fairly dark, you know, Orange Crush and Hair Shirt and World Leader Pretend and I Remember California. No weak tracks on this one, I don't think. Stand, I even like Stand, you know, it was a fun tune. A lot better than their other big fun tunes, Shiny Happy People. Though I must say my all-time favorite R.E.M. song is not on this album. It's on their follow-up album, Half a World Away, is probably my favorite R.E.M. song, but this remains my favorite R.E.M. album. On to number 14. Number 14, going way back to 1968, 1970 with this one. Two albums, actually, a tie at number 14. Between Van Morrison's Astral Weeks and Moondance. When I was young, say in my teenage years, into my 20s, I hated Van Morrison. I don't particularly know how I was exposed to Van Morrison at that age. I think it might have been the late night concert shows on TV, like Don Kirshner's rock concerts or Burt Sugarman's Midnight Special or CBC concerts that they used to show in Canada. But I knew who he was, and I knew that I didn't like him. I remember thinking, how in the world has anybody listened to this guy? He's terrible. He's got a terrible voice, just awful. He's no David Lee Roth. God. Anyway, flash forward 10 years or so to the same record store that I worked at in my mid-20s, and out comes a new Van Morrison album. I think it was Enlightenment. And my boss, the guy who owned the record store, loved Van Morrison and would play it a lot. And it started to grow on me. And then I started falling in love with this soulful R&B Irishman, and especially his voice. And how the hell did that happen? Maturity, I guess. Regardless, I had found an artist with a 25-year back catalog of music to explore, and explore it I did. I started with his greatest hits, and when that would no longer do, I dug into his classic albums, and the two that stood out head and shoulders above the rest were Moondance and Astral Weeks. From the title track and great classic Moondance, the song, to Caravan, and It's Stone Me, and especially his masterpiece, Into the Mystic. I was in love with this guy that I used to hate, kind of like the opposite of Genesis, I suppose. And Astral Weeks, just brilliant stuff. Cypress Avenue, Madame George, Sweet Thing, and the title track itself. One of the greatest albums ever made, just classic. And moving on to number 13. A bit of an outlier here at number 13. Matthew Good Band, Underdogs. From 1997, Canadian artist Matthew Good's second album and first major label release. Back in the late 90s, post-grunge, kind of like alt-rock bands like the Foo Fighters and the Smashing Pumpkins and Jimmy Eat World and Incubus and bands like that were riding high with worldwide popularity and success. While up here in Canada, our own homegrown alt-rock superstar Matthew Good was finding great Canadian success, but garnering very little interest outside of Canada. While Underdogs was Matt's major label debut, And it did go double platinum here in Canada, selling like 300,000 copies or something. It was a beautiful Midnight, his follow-up album that really cemented his status as an alt-rock superstar here, at least here in Canada, winning Album of the Year at the Canadian Grammys and whatnot. And why didn't he break worldwide in a big way? I've asked myself this many times. It turns out that it was somewhat self-sabotage on Matt's part. He refused to play by the rules of his record company. The promotional rules, screw that. Extensive touring throughout the U.S., screw that. Interviews, no. He wanted nothing to do with any of that stuff. And Matt has always been a troubled guy who refused to play the game. And it was his way or no way. And he's gone through tons of band members and whatnot. Actually, at one point in the 90s, he had a nervous breakdown, tried to commit suicide, and spent an extended period in a mental hospital. While he was in that mental hospital, he wrote an album called Hospital Music, which is utterly brilliant. A very personal album about his recovery and about his nervous breakdown and whatnot. Anyway, I digress. Matthew Goodband, Underdogs, one of the great alt-rock albums of the 90s that no one knows outside of Canada. Intelligent, storyful, sad at times, rocking at times, and just an all-round great album without a weak track. And Matt had an amazing voice. Do yourself a favor, if you like 90s alt-rock type stuff and you want to hear a great album, check out Matt Good's Underdogs. Key tracks here would be Rico. I love Rico. Everything is Automatic. That was a big hit here in Canada. What do we got? Primetime Deliverance, amazing song. Apparitions, another big hit here in Canada and another amazing song. Just a great album. Please check it out. I'm a huge fan of Matt Good. He's still pumping out albums and big fan. On to number 12. 12, Steve Earle, Copperhead Road from 1988. I'm a huge Steve Earle fan and have been for many years. This album was my introduction to Steve Earle. Now, I don't particularly like country music, especially the nonsense that they spew out of Nashville these days. And while I don't consider Copperhead Road to be a country album, Steve did have his roots firmly planted in the country music scene. His previous two albums before that, Exito and Guitar Town, were pretty strictly country albums, but good country, classic country sounding type stuff, good storytelling type country. After my introduction to Steve Earle with Copperhead Road, I went back and I listened to his earlier work and found it quite pleasing to my ear, despite it being more traditional country type stuff. I think it was his voice and his storytelling quality that I like so much. That said, Copperhead Road is where Steve decided to rock out a bit. While much of it is still kind of country tinged, some songs more than others, I suppose, I consider this a rock album, albeit kind of like an outlaw rock album. The kind of stuff I imagine, you're a biker and you're on your chopper going down the highway, that long desert highway. This is the kind of stuff you're listening to. Copperhead Road, the song comes on the radio. Even to this day, it goes up. I just love it. It's the only song with bagpipes in existence that I can listen to, and not only listen to, but I love it. Side one of this album is just fantastic. The title track, Snake Oil, Devil's Right Hand, the collaboration with the Pogues on Johnny Come Lately, all great stuff. Easily one of my favorite albums of all time. Didn't even have to think about this one while I was compiling this list. It was one of the first ones that came to mind. Copperhead Road is going on my list. I love me some Steve Earle. Number 11, Moving Pictures by Rush from 1981. I knew there needed to be a Rush album on this top 20, but which one would it be? I listened to and played so much Rush when I was a teenager. It was insane. 2112 was great. Side 2 was noticeably weaker than Side 1. Hemispheres was fantastic throughout. Farewell to Kings was brilliant. But in the end, I had to go with Moving Pictures, an album that I would imagine to be on a lot of random guys' top 20 album lists, especially if they like rock music. Getting away from the super long epic prog pieces that dominated their previous three albums. With Moving Pictures, they focused on quality over quantity. Gone were the 22-minute long set pieces. In their place were 4, 5, 6 minute long, perfectly structured mini epics. Limelight and Red Barchetta and the famous Tom Sawyer and Witch Hunt and Camera Eye. Just an incredible album and Rush's finest overall. It had to be Moving Pictures at number 11. Top 10. Now, here we go. Another change of pace and another album that would show up on many top 20 lists. Fleetwood Mac. Rumors. This album, Christ, absolute perfection and timeless. They could have released this album last week and it would still sound fresh and it would still dominate the charts upon release. Between Lindsey Buckingham's brilliant songwriting and guitar playing, coupled with Stevie Nicks, of course, and Christina McVie, they created one of the most perfect albums of all time. No filler, not one wasted space on this album. An album that practically everyone can appreciate, whatever your taste in music. There may be those who don't like it, but there are very few who can deny its importance and brilliance. I still listen to The Chain and Go Your Own Way on a regular basis in my car on the way to work. And I still enjoy it as much as I did some 40 odd years ago when I first heard it. Simply timeless music. I can't say enough good things about this album. On to number 9, another tie, this time with Iron Maiden following up Fleetwood Mac. I couldn't pick between Power Slave and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, so I decided to go with both and give it a tie. I bought Iron Maiden's first album on the day it was released back in 1980 when I was 16 years old. I had no idea who they were. I walked into the record store one day on a Tuesday. That's the day that the new albums come out. And here was this album sitting right out front with this big death's head on it and this monster-looking beast with Iron Maiden in red letters above it. And I thought to myself, this looks heavy and this looks good. And so over went my $10 and I brought it home without knowing a thing about it. I threw it on the turntable, I cranked it up, and it was heavy and it was good. And I loved it right away. Their next album, Killers, took them to another level, better songwriting, better playing. And then they really hit it out of the park with Number of the Beast and with a change of vocals to Bruce Dickinson and a much more polished delivery, on the Number of the Beast. And I was close to putting Number of the Beast in this spot. When I really thought about it, I think Power Slave is the better album. They were really at their peak at this point in their career, their songwriting peak, and their music was becoming more complex. The riffs were becoming more complex. The songwriting was better, and Dickinson was at his absolute finest. Plus, they were starting to do these long, 10 to 14 minute long epic numbers like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which I absolutely loved. And Aces High, goddamn, one of the greatest side one track ones of all time. Just punches you right in the face, that song, when you put that album on. Just great stuff from Dave Murray and Adrian Smith on this album as well. Which leads me to Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, a bit of a departure for the band as they started to add like a few keyboards into the mix and whatnot. And some say that would be the death knell of a metal band, but it was the 80s, so lots of bands were doing it, and they incorporated them so well and tastefully and sparingly that they hardly distracted because of the big step up in songwriting that they had crafted at this point in their career. Infinite Dreams and the title track and the Clairvoyant and Can I Play with Madness, just great stuff. It was a brave and adventurous concept album that Maiden had created here, and it's one of their masterpieces, and just great stuff. Both albums, my two favorite Iron Maiden albums. Number 8, the mighty Van Halen and Van Halen 1, released in 1978. The first time I heard this album, I think I was 14, and it changed my life. I had started playing guitar at this point, but I hadn't really been taking it too seriously, and that all changed in a flash. I'm just like, I want to do that. I want to play like that, and I want to look like that lead singer. So I started practicing hard, and I grew my hair down the middle of my back, and I dyed it blonde, and covered my walls with Van Halen posters, which did not come down till about 5 or 6 years later when I moved out on my own. This was a game changer album, a once a generational game changer as far as rock and roll and hard rock goes. All killer, no filler, balls to the wall rock and roll, unlike anything the world had heard up to that point. They were the whole rock and roll package. They looked cool. They sounded cool. They looked like they were having fun. They partied hard. They got the girls. They could play the hell out of their instruments. Like I said, not a bad track on this album. I could go through this album track by track by track, but what's the point? Every single one of them are great, and just Van Halen's masterpiece debut. Number 7 from 1984, Metallica and Ride the Lightning. Granted, there was metal before Metallica. But like I stated with Van Halen, Metallica changed the game. They took it, they polished it, they made it faster, they made it more complex, heavier, darker, and more importantly, they put songwriting first and foremost. While their first album, Kill 'Em All, was really good, it was very crude and raw Metallica. Sure, heavier and faster than a lot of their contemporaries, but the songwriting was a bit lacking in depth and complexity. That all changed with Ride the Lightning. I was on to Metallica pretty early on. I was about 18 and a metalhead, so I was on to Metallica pretty early when they first came out. I liked their first album a lot, but it wasn't really revolutionary in the metal scene. It was just very, very good. But when Ride the Lightning came out, myself and my friends and bandmates at the time were just absolutely blown away. This was a fucking metal album unlike anything else ever made before. God damn it, did I love Metallica when they thrashed, Fight Fire with Fire and Battery from Master of Puppets. And but one of my all-time favorite Metallica songs is from Ride the Lightning. And I looked up a review of Ride the Lightning a couple of days ago. And so they had this track by track, best tracks on Ride the Lightning from worst to best. And they had Trapped Under Ice at number 8 as the worst track on Ride the Lightning. And I'm like, what? It's like one of the best tracks on Ride the Lightning. Just the frenetic panic, the music of Trapped Under Ice so perfectly matches the theme of being trapped under ice and the lyrics to being trapped under ice. Just this frenetic panic, and it just works so well for me. It's probably my favorite track on Ride the Lightning. That and Fight Fire with Fire because of the thrash aspect of it. But just brilliant, game-changing stuff from Metallica with this album, and then Injustice for All and Master of Puppets and then they lost me, and then I was done. I was done with Metallica for a long time. Didn't much care for the Black Album and Load and Reload and all that nonsense they were doing. But anyway, early Metallica, killer. Where are we? Number 6? Number 7? I'm going to go look. Be right back. All right, number 6. We're getting there, and we're staying heavy. We've got Alice in Chains with Dirt. At number 6. Sometimes I think it sucks being older, and then other times I feel happy to have lived through some of the great periods of music that I've loved over the years and not have to dig back through these great artists' catalogs to feel like I was born in the wrong generation or something. As far as music goes, I think I was born in the perfect generation. I've loved every bit of the musical ride. I'm not huge on 60s music, except Hendrix, of course. Not so keen on the early 70s stuff, except maybe Sabbath. But I got to experience the Van Halen years and the hair metal years and the thrash metal years and the grunge explosion. I was 28 or 29 when grunge hit, and I loved every minute of it. Hair down to my waist, flannel shirt, army boots, work socks, combat shorts. The whole look and the music moved me like nothing else. Still does. Probably my favorite genre of music overall. This album and one more yet to come on my list define that whole era for me. Jerry Cantrell, a bloody beast on the guitar. And I don't know whose voice I love more, Lane Staley, Chris Cornell, or Eddie Vedder. But as far as grunge bands go, this album is hard to beat. There's only one other that touches it, in my opinion, and we'll get to that because it's coming up. But Alice in Chains were about the most metal of the four big grunge bands, and one of the reasons why I like them so much. Just a devastating opening track on this one with Them Bones, followed by so many other great tracks. Down in a Hole, Damn That River, Rooster, of course, God, Angry Chair, and finishing up with Wood. Just a great song. Anyway, they would never match this album, sadly. But they continued to put out some good music, mostly driven by Jerry Cantrell because Lane was a heroin junkie. But anyway, just classic Alice in Chains, Dirt. Moving on, number 5, I think, or 4. Number 5, Left Turn Time Again, 1973, I think. Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen. For years, I never got Springsteen. While many of my friends ranted and raved about how great Springsteen was, I was always a bit meh. He's all right, I guess. All through the late 70s and 80s, hell, I guess even into the 90s, I really had no interest in Springsteen. He was always just there, making hits, not anything that I really wanted to listen to. I actually quite disliked him during a spell in the 80s when he went kind of like supernova with Born in the USA. I really hated that shit. But things change, and, we get older, our tastes change, and we mature, I suppose. About 15 years ago, I started getting into Bruce, and once I got into him, I couldn't unget him. I was hooked and bloody awesome, and to finally fall in love with an artist's music that has such a huge back catalog to dig into, somewhat like what happened with Van Morrison a little earlier on. And boy, did I dig into it. The Rising in Nebraska and Darkness on the Edge of Town and Tunnel of Love and just all of it. I went right back to the first album. Hell, I even started to appreciate Born in the USA a little bit more for how great it was. But none of them compare to Born to Run. This was his masterpiece. I've heard the album Born to Run, or the song Born to Run, 1,000 times or more, and I could listen to it 1,000 times again and still not get sick of it. It's the perfect rock and roll song. And then, you've got Jungle Land and 10th Avenue Freeze Out and Thunder Road. Brilliant song. Dude is still going strong, playing 3.5 hour long concerts at 70 years old. I saw him about 4 years ago at 66. He played for 3 hours and 15 minutes and absolutely killed it. The guy is a machine, and I absolutely adore Bruce Springsteen, and Born to Run is one of my favorite albums of all time. On to number 4. Anyway, enough about Bruce. Number 4, Pearl Jam, 10. Now, I've already told you how much I love the grunge era of music, and this is one of the defining albums, of course. Practically everybody's favorite Pearl Jam album. Sure, there are some who prefer others, but not very many. Most Pearl Jam fans would have been content with them remaking this album over and over again for the next 25 years. But that's not growth as a band now, is it? I personally love the whole Pearl Jam ride from start to finish to where they are today, still pumping out albums, albeit every 5 years or so these days, unfortunately. I followed along, bought and enjoyed every single Pearl Jam album on this 25-year ride, but it all comes back to 10 in the end, the album which kind of started it all. No weak tracks, not a one. A few big hits here and there. Maniac lead singer, if one watched the videos at the time that were released from this one for like Alive and Even Flow, and an amazing video for Jeremy. They hit the scene with the force of a jackhammer and cemented themselves as one of the bands to be reckoned with within the whole grunge explosion. Of course, the standout tracks would be Jeremy, Even Flow, and Alive, the bigger hits. But others like Release and Deep and certainly Black. Goddamn Black was a great fucking song. That one line from Black sticks with me to this day as one of the greatest lyrics of all time, where he sings, I know someday you'll have a beautiful life. I know you'll be a star in someone else's sky, but why can't it be in mine? That just makes me want to cry. That is so heartbreaking. And just one, I think that's one of the greatest lines ever written. Sorry, my phone is chiming. Anyway, Pearl Jam 10, number 4, just an incredible album. And as their whole catalog is just incredible. On to number 3. Number 3 from 1973, I think, Supertramp, Crime of the Century. Now, you may think it odd that I have this album so high on my list, considering my taste in music, or maybe not, because it's quite varied. But this album goes back to when I was a teenager. It was one of the first albums I ever bought when I was a kid. I think I was like 12 in 1974, 75. This album, upon release, was a massive hit in Canada. It exploded here bigger than anywhere else in the world. Something about it, I guess, struck a chord with us Canadians at the time. This album defined my childhood. I listened to it relentlessly. I could not get enough of it. It was being played everywhere I went. The beach, in cars going by on the highway, at family get-togethers, by all my friends, everywhere. It was omniscient. It was the soundtrack of my youth. School, Bloody Well Right, Rudy, and the masterpiece title track, Crime of the Century. This album obviously means a lot to me, and like Copperhead Road, I didn't have to think about this one. It was one of the first albums to come to mind when I decided to put this list together. In my mind, this album, as far as progressive rock in the 70s goes, is right up there with Pink Floyd. Which leads me to number 2, I guess. Dark Side of the Moon, from the same year, I think, 1973, and another album that I bought when I was about 12 or 13 years old. No big surprise here. Of course, Dark Side of the Moon would be on a lot of people's lists. Some prefer Animals, some prefer Wish You Were Here. The rare few prefer The Wall. I don't much care for The Wall, actually. But it's usually Dark Side of the Moon that top most people's lists, and deservedly so. And another soundtrack of my youth album that I listened to repeatedly and nonstop. I've owned every iteration of this album over the years. I first bought it on 8-track. When I wore that out, I bought it on album. And then I bought it on cassette, and then I bought it on CD, and then I bought it on the remastered CD, and now I have it on digital format. I still listen to it at least once a month, sometimes more, in its completion. Simply one of the greatest albums ever made. Hell, I think it is the greatest album ever made. It's just not my personal favorite. That distinction would go to this album from 1982 and Faith No More's Angel Dust. The perfect metal album ever made, in my opinion. I love absolutely everything about this album. It's heavy, it's intelligent, it's aggressive, B-aggressive, B-E-aggressive, B-E-A-G-G-R-E-S-S-I-V-E. See what I did there? It's weird, it's wonderful, it's funny, it's heavy, it's on and on and on. It's got one of the greatest hard rock metal vocalists of all time on it with Mike Patton. 0 weak tracks. Some might say RV. I fucking adore RV. I love that song, as well as Kindergarten and Crack Hitler and Everything's Ruined. Brilliant song. Midlife Crisis, Small Victory, Malpractice. Every song different from the last, and every last one of them is brilliant. A masterpiece of hard rock metal music, and my favorite album of all time. You still here? Random guys? You watched the whole thing? If you did, I thank you. It was fun to do. Agree with me, disagree with me. Of course, music is subjective. We all like different things. But those are my thoughts on some of my favorites. I hope you enjoyed watching it. I would hope that you might check out a few of those that I mentioned that you may be unfamiliar with, especially Matthew Good and the Matthew Good Band. I'm a big fan of his, and I think he deserves far more attention outside of Canada than he ever received. And so go check out some Matthew Good. Go check out Hospital Music. Go check out, especially go check out Underdogs. Great album. Beautiful Midnight, Avalanche. He's had so many great albums over the years. I think he's got about 15, 16 albums, and all of them good. And but especially Underdogs. And if you like that, check out Beautiful Midnight, and then check out Avalanche. Anyway, take care of yourselves. I hope you enjoyed that. I had fun doing it, and we'll see you next time. Take care. Ciao.